great turnout. In the 27 years that I worked as an organizer and rep for CWA, one of the best groups, most lively groups that I ever worked with on their first 2 contracts. It's the GSEU, when they had their own local, back in the good old days when they first got recognized by the state. And I'm really glad to see so many people struggling to take back the union today and participate in this recent election in 1104, the current home, and to be so involved in the current contract struggle. It's a very difficult fight. I just want to throw out a couple of things so we get into general discussion as quickly as possible to kind of mediate the pale mail and staleness of the panel here. I think one of the things we obviously should be trying to grapple with today is, what do labor activists inside and outside of academia do at this particular moment to capitalize on what we're told is a great sweeping change about to occur in this country as a result of a change in administration. The economic crisis has led more and more people in the media and in politics to kind of talk about this current situation in sort of New Deal terms. This is the worst economic recession, depression, wherever we're headed, since the early 1930s, and that ushered in a great era of progressive social change and worker organizing. There's some people in the labor movement, clearly, who hope that their critical support for Obama in certain battleground states is going to lead to long overdue amendments to the Wagner Act that was passed in the mid-30s as a product of the great worker upsurge of the 30s, and which led to further organization of millions of workers. Is that scenario reproducible in our time? Do we have the clout? And if not, how do we get it to amend that law all these years later to unleash a new wave of mass organizing in our own time, whether it's under the banner of SEIU or CWA or the IWW? Maybe everybody would get a piece of the action. For people in the public sector, since the Wagner Act and the Employee Free Choice Act that is being promoted today is primarily to address the incredible weakness of unionization in the private sector. In the public sector, the economic crisis is leading to budget cuts, job losses, a fiscal crisis at the state, county, municipal level that's clearly complicating the day-to-day union work of people within the State University of New York, trying to negotiate a new contract for grad students. It's affecting people in AFSCME, CSEA, a lot of other parts of the public sector where, union density, if you want to use that term, is a little bit greater today. So does this supposedly great political sea change open any doors in terms of public sector unions going on the offensive as well? So I would throw those out quickly as a couple of topics for discussion.
My name is Paul Poulos. I've been a member of the Industrial Workers of the World and organizer for 30 years. That didn't happen out of the blue. It was a result of my experiences. Sorry, Joe, if this offends you.
I agree with you. I know what you're going to say.
But
I have a two-ton magnet swung on my head because of what you're going to say. Go
I
ahead.
have the real distinction of being a member of probably one of the most corrupt unions in this country, and perhaps even the world, Teamsters. And the 2 locals that I was in for 25 years, there were 2 business agents were shot, one in front of his home 9 times and the other in the union. I mean, that's the worst of it. But the total lack of democracy, the total control, people, working people, Teamsters were actually held captive of organized crime. And many of the locals within the Teamsters, and there's 700 within the international or thereabouts. There's been some changes as a result of a government trusteeship in the 80s. The 21-member executive board, in fact, they agreed to a trusteeship principally because they didn't want to go to jail.
Right.
So the government has been in control of the union now for the last 2 decades. In any event, my experiences in the Teamster Union led me to the IWW. I was introduced to the IWW, and it opened up a new vision for me in terms of the level of democracy, and the level of control members have. It's a union control from the bottom, not from the top. And it's unfortunate that I could say that the Teamsters weren't an abortion, so to speak,
I agree, I tried to get him out of my shop,
but
because I got threatened.
it's characteristic of what, maybe not that extent that I described, but more or less in terms of structure. Most unions follow that pattern, top-down pattern. I agree with Steve that there has to be a discussion about this new development, new presidents and the changes that are going to become, the importance of us being active or part of that change and developing some strategies. But I really think it's important for us. I think there's a large deficit in the structure of unions themselves, the competitive nature of them themselves. I'll keep this short, I'll try to keep it short. The IWW is unique in that we do not organize a job or a shop. We organize workers, okay? And into industrial unions, industrial union classifications from top to bottom. It makes us more effective in terms of being able to react to one another's problems and develop that kind of solidarity that's necessary in the Teamster movement. And we haven't seen that. I mean, the worst example probably was with PACO when Reagan destroyed that union. In large part because it didn't get support from other labor organizations who sat back either. And most of which couldn't do anything because they all negotiated no strike clauses in their contract. But I'm going on too far. I think what we have to do is, or labor has to do, is to develop a global attitude. It's not enough to say you're an international union because you have a local in Canada or Puerto Rico. We have to start to identify with workers around the world, and not in a way that demeans them, and not in a way that puts us in competition with them, okay? Because there's no way in the world that American workers can compete with somebody in Bangladesh getting paid $46 a week. There's no way that we can compete with that. And you'll hear big business telling you, competition, we can't compete. Well, you're never going to compete. The only way you can compete is you drop our wages to that level, okay? The other alternative for us as a global unit is to raise wages globally and conditions, both in terms of human rights and being able to live.
Let me go next.
I'm Melvin Dubovsky. I'm primarily a historian, but I'm also a retired union member, and I guess I was also present at the creation or the birth of GSEU on this campus when it obtained its first contract. The militant minority, or the spark plug unionists on this campus, the ones who created it, were all graduate students in the history department. And after they obtained the first contract, one of the clauses that dealt with resolving graduate student employee grievances, if the grievances could not be resolved, they were allowed, they chose an ombudsperson to represent them with the administration in unresolved grievances. I was chosen. Apparently, early on, they were extremely successful. I never had to intervene in an unresolved grievance. I don't know the history since. I was a member of the faculty union. I guess one could call me, at least on this campus, an insurgency of one. But I won't go into the specifics of my disagreement with the union leadership. Let me just speak for a few minutes about what, if anything, the past can tell us about the present. And believe me, the past never repeats itself. But there are, certain patterns. And I won't talk about the whole industrial or urban world. I'll limit myself to this country. There's only been one period in our national history in which you could say that prosperity or the rewards of economic productivity were widely shared. And that's the quarter of a century from the end of World War II to the end of the 60s, early 70s. And that was the one period in which unions had substantial density. At the peak in 46, 48, and 51, 53, unions represented 1/3 of non-agricultural employees in this country. In what were then major sectors of the economy, steel, electrical appliances, automobiles, rubber, petrochemicals, I can go on. Unions, and several of them represented nearly 100% of the labor force. And the large companies that managed to exist non-union did so to a large degree by matching, and in some cases, exceeding what the unions won for their members. I still remember, this is well after unions had begun their decline. I had a former son-in-law who was an Intel company employee. Intel is non-union. He showed me the company's employee booklet. It wasn't what you would think of as an employee booklet. It looked like a modern union contract. It was that thick. And on paper, the benefits it granted employees and the forms of protection it offered them. Now, there were differences, but it was patterned after what would be a late 20th century union contract. Because Intel began when unions, although declining, were still powerful. Now we're in a situation that's comparable to the situation on the eve of the Great Depression. 1929-30, proportion of the private sector labor force organized or unionized, perhaps 7 or 8%. Today, the same. The only difference is, back then, public employees, by and large, did not have the right to unionize. Today, 35% of public employees, as compared to private sector employees, are union members. But you have to understand something about union membership in this country. It's concentrated, really, in 7 or 8 states. And public employee unionism is almost the same. Most of the so-called, red states, and why so-called conservative states are red, so-called liberal states are blue, escapes me. Usually it's the other way around. But in the so-called red states, many of them, it is not legal for public employees to be represented by unions. Or in those states where they're allowed to be union members, the unions are legally forestalled from bargaining collectively for their memberships. So, unionism is not evenly spread across the country. Let me say another thing based on history. In small ways and large ways, changes in administration at the municipal, the state, the national level can make differences. I won't give you a big example. Everybody talks about the New Deal now. I'll give you just two small examples. One that goes back to the Jimmy Carter administration. Overall, Carter was bad for unions and labor because the administration was very split on these issues. And he gave more weight to what could be called his economic advisors, who were all deregulators, than his social policy advisors. But the National Endowment for the Humanities did something interesting. They underwrote summer seminars for union leaders. And 3 historians ran those seminars that lasted, it was roughly 4 years, because that's all the Carter administration lasted. Herbert Gutman, David Brody, and I. It was very interesting. So-called union leaders were not what the public thinks of as union leaders. They were mostly from, or even say the middle ranks of the union movement. They were those that, I would call the spark plug unionists or the militant minority. And it was very interesting. I did it for 2 summers, the summer of '80, the summer of '81. I had roughly 15 people in each seminar. For most of the local officials, it was the only free time they had ever had. I had a young man, not yet 30, who was the president of the largest union local in the state of Oregon. A local of United Food and Commercial Workers that represented supermarket employees. This young man was responsible for administering a union that's membership fluctuated between 8 and 10,000. And this is in basically, I won't say the but the early computer age, when things had to be done on paper and took forever. When he was here, I don't know how much sleep he got, because he was constantly on the phone with calls from Portland, but it was the first time he had ever read anything. And I think what happened as a result of the seminars, or at least for the participants, and it didn't matter whether they were in one of mine or Gutman's or Brody's, they had a chance to read, to explore, to look at issues in a much broader context. But in 1981, of course, a new administration came into power, a new head of the National Endowment for the Humanities. They continued their summer program or summer seminars for professionals, but the only seminars they continued for professionals were for medical professionals and legal professionals, labor professionals, if you want to call them that, scrapped. More recently, the Carter. the Clinton administration. Again, like Carter, the Clinton administration, very mixed record on labor issues. But they appointed a chair of the National Labor Relations Board, call him the pre-Obama. Like Obama, he was of mixed racial heritage and even lighter complected than Obama. Name is Bill Gould, and he wrote a very interesting memoir about his experiences as chair of the National Labor Relations Board. He really tried to move it in a direction that would make it more manageable or easier for workers to unionize. When he was confirmed in his appointment by the Senate, the Republicans did not know that he was of mixed racial origin. They thought he was a white man. He writes about this. And the moment they discovered that he was of mixed heritage, on the floor of the Senate, he became the subject of racialized comments. But the Republicans in the Senate then had enough members to defeat any effort to alter fundamental national labor law or the operations of the NLRB. And Gould was so frustrated, he resigned and returned to Stanford Law School. Well, once again, a new administration is coming in. It's not going to be the New Deal reborn. Because let me be honest, I don't see the pressures outside that boiled up in the 1930s at work here today. But a new administration provides openings, an opportunity. What dismays me is the labor movement is weak to begin with today. And ever since this change to win body was formed, been sort of, I don't know what to say, dubious, negative. It bears no relationship to the origins of CIO. CIO was born at a moment of surge and growth. That doesn't exist today. And I really think now, more than ever, one of the first things that should happen is for the leaders of CW, TCTW, and one of them is a leader there only because of me, that's Bruce Rayner, to get together with the AFL-CIO leadership and agree on a common program to press with the new administration. And let me be honest, it's important to reform labor law in this country. But I really think first things first. They have to combine to support a program of substantial, and I would call it aggressive, public spending. Public spending that not only will put money in people's pockets, but create jobs that pay well. Because such public spending will largely be on infrastructure projects in which wage rates, assuming they will pay the prevailing rates, are well above median rates. I think for the immediate present, the most important thing is to get the economy moving. And I think, weak as labor is today, they should use whatever resources they have, they still have political weight, to move ahead. Lee?
Thanks, Mel. Well, my name's Lee Conrad. I'm the National Coordinator of Alliance at IBM, CWA Local 1701. I grew up in this area. I've been involved in the progressive movement since I got out of the service in 1970. Worked at IBM for 26 years. Now, for those of you that don't know, IBM was founded here in Endicott, New York. At one time, there was 15,000 employees here. Now there's about 1,100. IBM has been getting out of manufacturing, not only in New York State, but pretty much throughout the whole United States. There's still 130,000 employees, though, and that's a large number of people to try and organize. But, you know, we believe in raising hell inside IBM, plain and simple. You know, IBM has never liked unions, has been hostile towards unions, and we've been organizing since the late 70s through some pretty dark periods. The Reagan administration, and all throughout IBM's history of paternalism. As Mel mentioned with the Intel handbook, that's similar to the IBM handbook. Cradle to grave, they called it. You know, you had, you know, free medical, you know, great pensions, so-called grievance procedures inside IBM. But there was also a dark side inside IBM, and that was in the manufacturing sectors, which IBM Endicott was a large part of. And that's where the union movement began. There was a lot of forced overtime. There was chemicals. You know, the clocks were pitted, you know, and people would joke that they'd go outside and choke on the fresh air. And so, you know, IBM workers, when we first started organizing, IBM Workers United was an underground movement. We didn't dare say that we were union activists. We had local community activists hand out our newsletters, newspapers from local community groups saying, these are the issues inside IBM. Saying that we were union activists, automatically we were branded traitors within IBM. And we were shunned, you know, you didn't even dare say it. It's like, you know, being shunned from a religion or something like that. And that's what IBM tended to be a lot alike. And we had a lot in common with the IWW back then. We used to get their newspapers, and, you know, basically we were out to raise issues that affected IBM employees. So for, you know, about 20 years, you know, we did this inside IBM. In 1984, we had our first international convention of IBM unions from around the world. Now this struck us as really, you know, an important event because for years IBM said, you know, don't listen to unions, don't believe in unions, we don't have unions. And then we started finding out, well, IBM Germany has a union, IBM Italy has a union, IBM France, and we started making all kinds of connections. And it was slow at first because, you know, back before the internet, it was letters and stamps. And it would take weeks to finally get a reply back from a union official in IBM. And they would say, oh my goodness, there's activists inside IBM United States. It was like the Red Sea had parted, you know, and it was just amazing. So, you know, we had kept doing that, having international conferences and conventions and organizing at the different IBM sites around the country. But it was always slow going because IBM still had that paternalism in place. Good wages, good benefits. And it wasn't until 1999 that all hell broke loose. And that was when IBM decided to change their pension plan from a traditional pension plan to a cash balance plan. And one thing you don't want to mess with IBMers is their money. You know, they get very upset. And what people started seeing was a 50% cut in their pensions. And so the uproar that this created, we were able to capitalize on because we had already had a network within IBM Workers United spread throughout all the plants and different offices that all of a sudden came together with people that were totally hostile to unions in the past, said, you know, now we've got to do something. So we did everything from set up websites, Yahoo groups, face-to-face meetings in 6 or 7 different IBM locations, and it scared the hell out of the company. because they had never seen this kind of worker upsurge inside IBM. And so, out of that was born the alliance at IBM. And I contacted Steve Early and Larry Cohen and said, now seems to be the time that we can start organizing inside IBM. And we eventually became an official local of CWA, Local 1701. A lot of people think it came from 1701 Starship Enterprise, being a high-tech union and the like, but it actually came from the address of 1701 North Street in Endicott for IBM. So, we let the enterprise thing stay out there because it's good for us. But so, out of that came a new set of building within IBM of union activists. Now, just to let you know, right now, we do not have a contract with IBM. We do not have recognition by IBM. We have not gone for a union vote inside IBM. A lot of people call us by a whole bunch of different names, non-majority union, association, employee advocates, but basically we're a union, just like they always were, fighting for workers' rights. We have picket lines, we have conferences with other unions, we have alliances. So, even though we don't have recognition by IBM, we are constantly putting pressure on them to do the right thing by employees. And we still face the same uphill battles of how do we reach people, how do we turn the tide of the anti-unionism that's not only in this country, but permeates the whole business inside IBM. The kind of people we're organizing range from manufacturing workers to scientists, and they're all in the same union, one big union more or less. And so we've tried to bring everybody together, the scientists and the manufacturing workers, saying, we have the same issues, the same problems. Jobs are being cut, pay is being cut, benefits are declining. So, we all have the same issues. We see what's happening with corporate management. The IBM had a 22% increase in profits this last quarter. They just cut the pay of Burlington workers 10%. I mean, it's that kind of agony that's going on inside the workplace that is driving more and more people towards thinking about unions. But it's still a long way. The whole labor law structure makes it very difficult to go for a union vote. So we just keep organizing, plant by plant, office by office, occupation by occupation, and keep raising the issues that are important to people. We have a very vibrant website. We get about 45,000 visits a month to it. We have comment section where we let people go in and vent over everything from what's happening with the company to offshoring of jobs. Once again, we're still very active, and this goes back to the globalism. IBM is a global corporation. They've tried to keep us all separate and say, your issues aren't relevant to the issues of people in Australia or Germany or Turkey. And what we're saying to IBM is, yes, they are. You're doing the same thing to us that you're doing over there. And, you're hostile towards unions here, and you're hostile towards them here. So we've had a number of international meetings, and we're really building that up because IBM, now has what's called a matrix. They don't really believe in plant sites. Our president, who works in the software group, works in a matrix. She reports to Denmark, Germany, and Italy, not to anybody in Endicott. Her work hours start at 4 in the morning because she has to work with the European countries. There used to be something called work-life balance inside IBM. They changed that to work-life integration. What that means is you work 24/7, So, the whole concept of what's happening inside the workplace, what's happening in the labor movement, both globally and nationally, we're trying to challenge. Right now, we've got a campaign of support with the IBM workers in Turkey. They went through their labor court to get recognition, and IBM's been fighting them tooth and nail. So what they're doing is IBM is having this big global meeting in Istanbul and bringing in people, corporate officials from Walmart, GM, talking about how IBM can help them. Well, there's going to be a mass picket line there saying, we support unionization for IBM workers in Turkey. And another tactic we've used, and that's in the newsletter I handed out, is we crashed their virtual worlds. That's a big thing with IBM, because, we've been involved in the internet. Gore might have said he invented it, but we did actually. And so, IBM has this thing called Second Life. Any of you know what Second Life is? All right, it's a virtual world that IBM has their own little offices and stuff. We had a strike there in 2000. And it started with the IBM Italy workers who had been going through negotiations with IBM Italy. They were denied their bonus, and pay cuts were coming through. So we all got together and we said, well, let's crash this and have a strike in their virtual world. So we got a lot of publicity out of this. And even though a lot of us were going, well, now how does this really work? Are they going to send virtual goons after us? I mean, we had no idea, and they actually did. We had a lot of planning through UNI, which is the global federation that CWA is part of. A lot of the high-tech companies are involved with UNI. And we had our planning committee, we had our organizers, just like a regular strike. We tried to figure out how we could have a burn barrel, a virtual burn barrel, but that never happened. But we had signs, T-shirts, and on a specific day, we all met at the big UNI stadium, and we had 1,800 avatars, that's what they call the virtual people, from 30 countries involved. And we shut down IBM's virtual community. We teleported into an IBM meeting, right? And this was fun because they were having this meeting, in a round table, and we just started, somebody got us the coordinates, so we started teleporting in with our signs and yelling and stuff, and literally shut down the IBM meeting, and they just, all of a sudden you see them disappearing, and we're there, and they did send the virtual goons in, and it was like, okay, they just stood there like this, like we just laughed, and they said, all right. That's not going to change much. But it was the first time that it happened. And so there's been a lot of publicity on how you use, virtual worlds to get your message across. Out of that came the fact that the IBM Italy workers got their bonus. The IBM Italy CEO was fired, and it got us more input from IBM workers around the world. Our website skyrocketed to 200,000 visits in a month, and it shut the website down. So, we've done a lot of different tactics to raise awareness of unionism inside IBM, everything from, congressional hearings, picket lines, stockholder actions, locally, having demonstrations at the different sites. So, we're doing this, we did it unofficially as IBM Workers United, building a movement inside IBM, and then officially as members of CWA. But without a contract, without recognition, we're still fighting for unionism. Thank you.
I guess I'm up. I know a lot of topics came up. The idea of this New Deal that might be coming up with the promise of Obama. Of course, the issue of labor in relation to an international trade system, an international global economy, which is always discussed when the issue of labor comes up, and then the issue of democracy within unions. I wanted to speak first to the issue of democracy in unions. My union, CWA Local 1104. I became a member back in 1999 when I first entered as a graduate student at Stony Brook University in Hispanic Languages Department. I can't imagine, I'm sure there are, but I couldn't imagine at that point a more inept union. Basically no membership meetings, regular membership meetings, no information being sent to the members at all on a regular basis of what was going on. Supposedly there was a newsletter, I never saw it, and at a certain point when one of our contracts was, coming up for negotiations, a lot of us came together and figured out, what's going on? We're paying 2% dues for one of the highest, the highest dues rates of any graduate student union in North America, in the world basically. And what are we getting out of it? So I came out of a rank and file movement. A lot of times when you have a union that already exists, with a contract, with an established, bargaining unit, an established union, a lot of these you'll see these reform caucuses pop up. And I sort of came out of a reform caucus that we called GSU Rank and File, and helped out with the website there and stuff, and helped organize the pickets. And a lot of, basic, meat and potatoes type of organizing, talking to people, very simple, talking to people, getting their emails, getting their phone numbers, getting people in different departments, key players in different departments, and getting them together in meetings and doing something, figure out what you need to do, what each step is going to be in terms of your organizing process. And that's sort of the tradition where I came out of, and as my experience of being a union member, union organizer. Part of my experience before that was being very active in the global justice movement and all the major mobilizations and stuff. And it was interesting the transition between being basically an anarchist socialist, revolutionary, something or other. I don't even know what to call myself because a lot of the terms are sort of antiquated. But one of those people going into a trade union with bylaws and a contract and all these formal, nasty, bureaucratic things, and going into that. And it's a very interesting experience, and I really think those of us who are involved in the social injustice movements and stuff, we should have, part of us, part of our beings, part of our who we are as organizers in unions, just to screw at them, because it's a lot of fun. I've sued my union probably more than any other member in our union. I filed a Department of Labor complaint, which is a historic complaint, which led to, unfortunately, I lost in the recent elections by 271 votes, but it led to I think the first general election in our union ever.
Competitive election, I think.
Ever.
Since the merger.
But even before the merger, when they were just their own phone workers, I don't think they had real competitive elections before. So there's a lot of rewards you can get out of it. I mean, as a result of that, we certainly have more victories than that. We have the majority now of the GSU decision-making body, or at least of the negotiations team. There's a lot of it's very frustrating working in unions. You have to look at it as a process. You're not going to get everything you want, all your demands all at one shot, but you'll get something, and you keep working at it and keep working at it, and it's difficult to stay sane, and it's difficult to stay it's difficult to stay out of debt, because a lot of this stuff is going to come out of your own pocket. Even though that's the last 2.5 years I was working as business agent for the union, but down in Long Island I was making $14,400, which up in Binghamton might sound like a lot of money, but in Long Island you get wrecked making that amount of money. And with no health insurance, basically. I was able to, at least from my perspective and some of our perspectives, push at the local campus level, because the campus contributes an amount of money in excess of what our shitty contract says. The contract says the minimum stipend should be about $8,500. Before that, a couple years ago, we were making $13,000 our members. We were able to push it, with a little luck, a little good timing, and a little pressure on the administration, we were able to push that to $15,145. So, what did I get out of it? I mean, I had members now making more money than I do, but it's definitely something that an amazing experience of being involved with members and representing people. I mean, it's absolutely priceless. So there's that sort of like that, being a union reformer, being involved with. I mean, those of you who I know aren't familiar with unions or whatever. There's books put out by the Association of Union Democracy, which, once you get involved with unions and trying to reform them, whatever, and you want to actually run for a competitive election, you got to know these things like, treat them as your Bible. Resources like Labor Notes, where you can read Steve's article, and knowing what's going on in unions that are also, just as screwed up as yours. And it's interesting, I see our union, as part of this merger that happened back in, in 2000, 2001, as part of a symptom of this notion of the mega local. I mean, our local isn't as it was a part of a merger of 3 different unions that came together and established a fairly large local, in my opinion, of 7,000 members. But when you look at it in a broader perspective of unions such as Service Employees International Union and those mergers over the last 5 years, I mean, you're talking about unions with hundreds of thousands of members, 150,000 members. And imagine running for office for one of those unions. I mean, just imagine getting 5%, some of the bylaws of these unions, you need 5%, signatures to get on the ballot. So how are you going to get 5% if you're working as a part-time worker, as a home care worker, for example, in California, one of these SEIU unions? How are you going to get 5,000, 5% of 150,000, 200,000 members and get on the ballot in 2 weeks? How is that possible? How is that feasible? I mean, I would love for us all to be organized at IWW, but how are you going to be organized like IWW if you have 200,000 members? So what do we do? How do we get toward being like IWW in this challenging environment of these mega local mergers and stuff? It's an interesting question. It's a very difficult question. I think the bad news is we're headed towards a crisis that we've never seen before. We're not headed towards a New Deal. The New Deal was in a moment of history where basically the world, the environment we live in had almost infinite amount of natural resources, including petroleum, where you could offer concessions to a revolutionary movement in basically kickbacks, FDR, Keynesianism and stuff. We're not headed in that direction. We don't have, there's going to be limited amount of resources to give kickbacks. We're going to be fighting for natural resources like water, like oil. And what are the political consequences of this? The labor movement has absolutely no idea how to deal with those issues because they're thinking 50 years ago. And that's the mentality of the labor leaders. So how do we deal with the problem of, we should be organizing workers in China, which we should be. But what do we do when there's going to be a moment when we're at war with China? Well, how are you going to deal with that? What are you going to do when China's no longer producing your goods and they want to produce their own goods because they won't be able to ship those goods from China to here? What are you going to deal with that? What are you going to do? How are you going to refurbish your factories? How are you going to refurbish your public infrastructure when you're not going to be able to afford buses? When you're not going to be able to grow your own food? When you're not going to be able to, when you're going to need to produce your own, commodities, when you can't longer get them in China. We have absolutely no clue. And I don't mean to be overly pessimistic, but we're headed for a serious crisis that, Obama, when he got elected, I was actually kind of depressed because I was like, our leadership has absolutely no clue. And the most important leadership in my view, the labor movement has absolutely no clue. So these are questions that are hugely, these are going to require, I guess, a whole nother conference just to answer these questions. But they're sort of the way I think, the trajectory I think we should be headed in terms of how are we going to organize as social justice activists, as revolutionaries, as anarchists, as communists, socialists, whatever. And how are we going to rebuild the labor movement? These are extremely important questions. And I think the solution to that is maybe getting small. And I don't like to, put a fetish on the small either, but it's going to, almost by necessity, almost by being forced into it, we're going to be forced into developing regional economies, into developing regional networks of, sustainable networks of being able to produce things in our environment. And I think labor unions, if they'll be called then in the future, or some form of organizing people at the level of production, are going to be necessary because I don't want to head into feudalism. I don't want to be working on the land because because that's where we're going to be headed. It's because we're going to need to grow our food more locally. I don't want some dude who has claims some noble background or some relationship to God telling me what to do. I want to be organized. I want to fight for my rights and be organized at 11. I think some form of organization, you can call it a union at the level of production, is going to be necessary to fight for the things that we're going to be fight against the things that we're going to be encountering in the future. And labor unions, political parties, with programs, with a vision of how we're going to rebuild a society, how we're going to live, how we're going to survive, are going to be crucial in the coming period, the coming crisis.
Yeah, I like what this young man had to say because being in the Teamsters, like I got my balls cut off in that conversation before. All right, I was at the local level. I was a shop steward. My guys got a $1 prescription program. I threw out the bastards who were running. I had a 2-ton magnet thrown on my head. But then you got this knee-jerk soundbite shit where somebody says, Teamsters, automatically mob. And that's what's wrong. That's why people perceive unions as shit. Because people go around and they go, Teamsters, blanket statement. All right? Because the union's been fighting each other at these large levels and not realizing what I dealt with. In a factory, you've got prison cliques. You had the Vietnamese guys running the CNC machines, the Polish immigrants running the rough grinding, and they didn't want to unionize because they had their own little unions because they didn't trust the union, and rightfully so. All right? So I had to start from the ground up and show these guys where they had a common interest. I think the union's got to be careful. They got to run it 2 ways. You need en masse power. So you can't go that local. All right? Yeah. But you also always have to be aware. From the ground up is right, like anarcho-syndicalism. It has to be built from the workers. When we had union organizers come into my place, they had PhDs and they were talking golf with the general manager. All right? They weren't from the guys. They didn't know how to talk to the guys. The Teamsters magazine, they asked me to work on it because I'm a writer. They never showed a Vietnamese face on that magazine. There were black faces. They finally got to black faces after a while, okay? Everybody on the magazine looked like me, like a fat white trash guy. All right, I'm going to lay it on the line. All right, we got a lot of problems. We're not looking at, we got to look at our unions. You can't be 60 years ago but at the same time, you gotta realize that we are in the same deep place. Things, you can do little things too that nobody talks about, like not getting easy pass, all right? Not doing anything to help the convenience-oriented society, which is a euphemism for getting rid of jobs, all right? And that's important too. So with all due respect, I don't blame you for attacking the Teamsters. I had a 2-ton magnet thrown at my head for saying the same thing. But you gotta be careful, because then you give people just the right to say the knee-jerk things, which to me is no bit different than saying, oh, all black people can dance. All Teamsters are corrupt. The guys I work with weren't corrupt, and a lot of them almost ended up losing their lives trying to clean up.
No, I, just in response to that, I wasn't criticizing the Teamsters Union.
Oh, no, I don't like the Teamsters Union.
Oh, wait.
I try to get the Machinists Union, but I just think from a strategy standpoint, we gotta start saying everything's corrupt. You're not gonna get a pure union. You gotta work towards a better life.
Let me tell you a story. I went to a Teamster convention in Orlando, Florida, Disney World, you know? And I had met the president of my union. I swear to you, I should drop that right here, if this guy didn't have a fucking ring on each
Every
hand.
kind of,
Diamond ring.
yes.
I swear to you, on the thumbs too.
The pinky ring, my own negotiator, I got it thrown out.
But
I
I
agree.
wasn't criticizing the Teamster Union as an outsider. I was a Teamster, and for years I fought them to nail. So
Right.
I'm not speaking from an outsider looking
Yeah.
in.
What I'm trying to say is that I think it's very important that we realize that we get rid of these stereotypes in unions, just like you get rid of the racial stereotypes. All right? Yes, there's corruption in unions. But the corruption in unions is no different than corruption in corporate structures or anything like that. And people, the leftist agenda has not been as savvy as the Republicans and these stupid conservatives who have learned how to use American media things to create these images of union people as beer-swilling, bigots, racists, look down this way. And there's a lot of truth in it, but there's a lot of non-truth in it. And this is what has hurt the union's growth. And also, they got to start telling middle, look at tech writers. I had tech writers laugh at me. They were making $140,000 a year. Now, their same job is being outsourced for India to a guy that's making 10. All right?
Yeah.
Don't think this isn't hidden management, people.
Yeah.
And they better start organizing it, right? Because most of your jobs, outside of being a CEO, are threatened.
Why don't we hear from more people in the audience?
Yeah, just,
Oh, yeah.
like, the problem is not only about the corruption, but also like there's this overall trend about the rate of unionized workers in the workforce, right? So as you know, Professor just talk about that. So in a sense, there's urgent need to just get started to unionize, and that there, I mean, Victor just like made a great point, because it's not only in a sense to increase the rate of unionized workers, but also how to do that. And there, like we have now a really great diversity in terms of not only work conditions, but in terms of the general characteristics of the work organizations. For instance, last year I did a field research in garment sector in Turkey, in Istanbul, Turkey. So I worked, like at a few, garment sweatshops as a worker, like parts in the observation, and also at a factory, and I also worked with industrial home workers. And I saw like such a big diversity in terms of how like workers got attached or got engaged like to the employment process, to the like actual labor process. I was particularly amazed. So in a sense, it's not only about the regional or let's say sector-based division, but also like increasing diversity in the work conditions, which create different kinds of let's say I would put it let's say intellect or let's say ways of thinking on the part of the workers. So they have different notions of getting organized. They have different version or like let's say ways of approaches about let's say the notion of organization. For instance, when you think about the industrial home-based worker, a woman like let me make a stereotype here. Like over 40 years old, having 2 children. This is why she couldn't just have like another real job, working like 10 hours at her home. So how come just could you go and like get her organized in a union, like like an organization looking like a union at least? and
Yeah.
IBM workers, for instance, like kind of much more white collar, like in a sense, etc. So that's why, I mean, for starters, at least, we should just, accept the fact that our organizations should be much more flexible in terms of their approaches and to the workers. And this not only about union democracy, of course, it's the most important thing here, but also, first of all, again, to turn the trend back, in terms of the rate of unionized workers in the workforce.
Right. Just a quick comment on that. I mean, one of the things that happened up in Burlington, Vermont was that the organizing committee up there, the rest of the country went with CWA. Up in Burlington, Vermont, they went with the IBEW, right? The IBEW pulled the plug on them after a year because they couldn't get enough cards signed. That's a different strategy than what we're looking at. We're looking at keep building workplace organizations regardless of whether or not we're getting the sufficient amount of cards signed. Because we're in this for the long haul. We're in it to change people's minds, to build workers' power inside IBM, and not necessarily just to get a union contract. So when you talk about rate of unionization, most unions looked at IBM and said, there's no way we're going to sink any money into this because there's no way IBM workers are going to, get a union. Well, we built a union. We built our own union, and thankfully we got CWA, helping subsidize us, but we've got dues-paying members. We've got 6,000 supporters around the country. 300 dues-paying members, not enough. We need more. But we're doing it on our own. Whether or not we get a contract or not, we're going to keep pushing the issues.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, in Victor, when he talked about the election, all of the first-year graduate students were not allowed to vote in the election. And on this campus, 30 to 40% of people had their ballots mailed to the wrong address. And every grad student I know who was allowed to vote voted for you. So I consider it a rigged election because so many people are disenfranchised. My question is about IBM. Why did you choose to affiliate with the CWA?
They seem to be the most progressive union out there that we had been in contact with. When we had IBM Workers United, we stayed away from the AFL-CIO. We wanted to remain independent. I came out of the anti-war movement after I got out of the service. And I remember the hard hats in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and that, and it just kind of turned us off. And we thought they were too conservative. And so we looked around for a number of different unions. And CWA was actually our second pick. Our first pick was the IUE, because they had a local up in Rochester that we thought would be able to help organize just manufacturing workers in IBM. And they did the same thing IBEW did up in Burlington, pulled the plug without even telling us. We couldn't get the number of cards signed, and that was it. Called their office up, and no phone number. Now CWA had already had an organization called WashTech, which is very similar to the Alliance. Larry Cohen has always talked about the need for alternative unionism within the labor movement. So after seeing that change in CWA, we felt, well, that's the way to go. It gives us more breathing room.
All graduate students are not state employees. That's part of the problem. Graduate students on fellowship are not employees. They're not eligible to be in the union or to vote in union elections. Loads and loads of science graduate students are not state employees. One of the big problems when the union was first formed, and one of their major demands was health insurance. They got health insurance, but graduate students on fellowship were initially left out. And so if you went from an assistantship to a fellowship, you lost health insurance. And so I encourage the union people to bargain for health insurance for people who weren't or couldn't be members of the union at a given time, and they obtained that. But that's one of the problems with graduate students. Another problem, this is pre-1986, was before 1986, tax law distinguished between income and what could be called grants. And if you had grants, it wasn't taxable income. So before 1986, before the union contract, graduate students on assistantship were not defined legally as employees. And so their income, and most of them did not have enough income to be subject to taxes, but some of them had spouses who had incomes, and they filed joint returns. And that was an issue. After 1986, it wasn't an issue anymore, because after 1986, the 1986 federal tax law, and this was Reagan Republican payback to pinko intellectuals and all, lumped fellowship and all forms of income into the same category, subject to taxes. But there are all kinds of issues that arise with graduate students that don't arise among other public employees or private employees. Think, for example, you can never have a permanent union membership because graduate student employees are transient employees. And so you have constant turnover. Membership is going to turn over. Leadership is going to turn over. And that creates problems of its own.
2 points. Well, I want to address this point first. Hypothetically, it'll turn over, but what happens when you have a leadership that continues to pay union dues, carry a $55,000, $70,000 salary, and has access to all the lists like our union does now? She's not a student, and hypothetically it turns over. This argue of we need continuity is actually kind of saying we need people from the outside to continuously be in, telling students what to do. The way that I've always fixed that, and the way that what Victor did was so amazing, was to add that essence of democracy and accountability, to change the bylaws so that people can run against her. And what it comes down to, I mean, you can get smaller and smaller, but if you do not have those fair bylaws, those bylaws that demand accountability, democracy, things like that, we would never have been able to run someone in Albany. We'd have to have collected 150 potential signatures. Like Jackie did, she collected 67, she needed 36, and I still told her no. But what Victor was able to do through what he did, this is really important, is he took the first step to actually, what might be close to a democracy in a trade union structure. He was able to change the bylaws to allow almost anyone to run who wanted to. And the next step, I mean, the elections, they were rigged, but they were rigged structurally. They were always rigged. And now that we know that for a fact, that's the next battle. And they're going to miss Victor Rosado. They really are, because I'm much more of a rat fucking bastard than he is. I face down multinational, I do coke, I face down like statewide nonprofits with $1 million budgets. They're going to miss Victor Rosado. Trust me on that.
It's nice to talk about democracy in the abstract.
It's not abstract. This
No,
is
let me continue. all
How
right?
about if we hear from some women in the audience who've had their hands up for a long time?
That's a good point, too.
Okay, Darren.
I just wanted to make a general comment because we seem to be pegged down by talking about individual unions rather than unionism, which is why I came to this workshop to begin with, because I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the alternative to unionism as a means of representing workers? What we have in this country, when we don't have unionism at all, is to have employment at will, which means if I don't like your shoes and I'm a boss, you're out of the room. Unionism, at its best, protects us in the workplace. We don't have to give up all our rights when we go into the workplace. So what we have to talk about is how to make unionism more responsive, but not to to get bogged down into this CWA or the IWW or this or that. It's what are our alternatives? I don't think we have them, and we just have to try to make things better. Woo!
Following along those lines, I mean, I think that we also, some of us are workers, some of us are students, some of us are both. There's some combination of all of these different things. And we're talking about these really big things that we can't fix, but that we all have a role in sort of building powerful coalitions and organizing on the ground. I mean, right here it was mentioned before that like Sodexo workers are up for contract renegotiations, and that, I mean, they first became unionized through a powerful coalition of folks who, like workers who were organizing and students and faculty and everybody who was, supporting the efforts within increasingly corporatized like university environments. So I think that we can all sort of like, see these big things and know that we're not going to fix like the strategies of international unions in like a year or 10 years, but that on the ground we can organize and talk to people and break down those artificial barriers of privilege and privilege is real, but at the same time it's like created to all of these like categories of student, worker, and all of those things are meant to keep people from talking to each other and uniting against these big powerful forces. So if we can start locally and think globally, as people keep saying, and start with that in our own campuses and communities, we can win material things and have been winning material things for years. And I think in some ways, like some of those big strategies will become more clear as they become less abstract. So if you're talking about like, working with unions, when, we worked with unions at our campus, we worked with non-majority unions like We Live for 150, we worked with SEIU, we worked with steelworkers, we worked with all of these different unions who were coming in, because we had relationships with workers on the ground. And, at every step of the way, we're trying to like build this coalition of organizing for like change and like using the institutional power of universities to influence change. So whether we're talking about the garment workers who make our collegiate apparel, the farm workers who put the food in our dining halls, the dining hall workers themselves, I think we can sort of like break this down into a little bit more of like concrete role and concrete organizing on the ground, while keeping in mind that these are really big, powerful structures that like are really messed up in lots of ways.
Yeah. Just real quick on the Sodexo, I'm also vice president of AFL-CIO here locally, and we're rebuilding that as well. That was pretty much dead in the water for many, many years. And so we've got a lot of progressives trying to, work together within the union movement locally. So the Sodexo campaign is something we're really interested in, and we marched through the cafeteria the first time the contract was signed. So we'll do it again.
Well, I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself because I know the key before this question even applies is organization itself. But it seems to me like CNT, the IWW, they were much more than just organizations that were trying to get a chunk of this 22% increase to IBM or the efficient system of election for union leaders. They're actually talking about workplace democracy, as we're seeing in the appropriation in like Argentina and Bolivia, and they're actually making cooperatives of an entire, their own tiered system that they create outside of the capitalist structure. So my question to the panel is, when do we hit that point where we're no longer simply trying to work within the confines of the worker-owner complex, that we're actually taking control of industry and making some of these decisions ourselves? Because to me, that's what unionism is. If the end goal isn't putting workers themselves in control of the means of production, democratically through elections or through consensus or whatever the means be that the workers decide in that particular workplace, then we're just working where it's organized begging. We're begging the ruling class for more of the pie to me. So my question is, when do we hit that point where we're going from organized begging to organized collective decision-making, workplace democracy?
When the workers get to that point. That's the thing. When you talk about IBM workers, you're talking about a workforce that traditionally was Republican for many, many years. So part of what we need to do inside IBM, and there's been changes because a lot of the older people are moving out and younger people are moving in, is education. And that's why a workplace organization needs to always be informing its members and the employees at large about what alternatives there could be out there. Whether it's through a newsletter, whether it's through email, face-to-face, it's a constant thing. It'll change when they're ready to change. But we got to push it.
Of course.
Well, I think the last time that more mainstream unions seriously engaged their own members and in a public way had any kind of debate about what's produced and how it's produced was in the early 80s, when there was an economic conversion movement, and you had, at that time, unions like the machinists and the UE and the auto workers actually having conferences and having bargaining strategies aimed at trying to develop plans to shift more production from producing military hardware to civilian uses. And people looked at the Lucas Aerospace experiment in England and other examples of where unions, rather than just bargaining about wages, hours, and conditions, tried to impinge upon management prerogatives, and particularly in defense industries, so-called defense industries, say, this Pentagon spending may look good, but it is not a secure source of employment, and what we're making is terribly destructive and wasteful and useless, and we'd rather, produce things for civilian use. Over the last 25 years, that economic conversion movement has petered out pretty much as a challenge to the military budget from the labor movement. But I think taking its place lately, is this idea of a green labor alliance, where if the unions don't start to get more creative about, the next wave of economic conversion related to dealing with global warming, that's going to have a job impact. It's going to have an impact on union strength and union contracts, on the skills that workers have or don't get a chance to use. And, unions have to come up with alternative production plans, working with environmentalists and other allies who can help them with that. And I think that's a way of picking up the ball that was dropped after the 80s.
You know what ESOPs are?
I don't know.
Okay. Provision of law, employee stock ownership plans,
Yeah, okay.
right? Which a company is literally going bankrupt. So the employees literally buy the company. It's theirs. You still have to have a managerial structure. Now, what happens? The managers are in place. Their primary concern, they represent the stock owners who are the employees. Their primary concern is to save the jobs, the income of the employees, to save the company. They come up with a decision. The employees who have stock ownership, voting ownership, there are different ESOPs, vote against management's plan. Democracy in action. And and there's no alternative plan, and the company goes under. I mean, there's a wonderful collection of essays some of you should read that were written at what could be called a roughly similar moment. It was published in 1928, called American Labor Dynamics. And, it was the same sort of situation. But again, when only 7 or 8% of private sector employees were in unions. Again, when there was all kinds of talk about the absence of union democracy and corrupt unions. Now, all the people who contributed the essays were then on what could be called the labor left. But they talk in very concrete terms, not abstract. A.J. Musty, I don't know if the name means anything to you. A.J. Musty has a wonderful essay there in which he says a union, he talks about whether they're internationals or locals, is simultaneously a town meeting and a military organization. In ordinary times, unions can be open and democratic. But what happens when a union is engaged in conflict with the other side? A strike. Can you be democracy in action? He says no. He says you have to have disciplined unity. And there's a whole collection of essays that deal with these sorts of problems. How do you unionize workers in unfavorable circumstances?
I guess, I can't answer your question specifically and then when and how. But there's a couple of things that speak against moving towards that end that you envision. And Victor's. I think Victor was right on. we're locked in a box with our thinking. I mean, the union movement. I mean, they're thinking in a box, and, you know, to get them to move beyond that box is, I don't know what it's gonna take. But as long as they maintain this service model of unionism, they're not gonna go anywhere. You know, and what has to happen from cradle to grave, we're all taught from early days going to school, our teachers, our parents and whatnot, we're taught to do certain things this way, that way, and the other way, and we come to school, and our instructors, you know, it's all locked in a box for us. What we have to do is start thinking out of the box. The IWW has three sort of axiomatic expressions: education, organization, emancipation. Okay? Those are the education being first, organization next, and freeing ourselves from wage slavery next. We also talk about abolition of wage system, but I'm not even going to go into that because I don't even understand it. You know, that's really thinking out of the box. But what I think people have to do, and are they ready for GSEA, GSEU? Are you ready to take on responsibility, move away from the service-oriented unions, and take responsibility yourself, empower yourself. Stop asking permission, because when you ask permission, you automatically infer that the other person has the power. Don't give them that power. Collectively get together, and with competence and with confidence, break those models that have been set for us and that service type of industry. Well, I belong to the union, I pay dues, and you know, they should be doing this, they should be doing this. You know, my mother should be doing this, my father should be doing, my teacher should be doing this, my union should be doing this. What are we gonna do? GSEU, I came here, I really didn't know much about the union until I read this. There's the term, what is it? Something about a crimson technology, something?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't care whether you're talking about IBM, and I don't care whether you're talking about GSEU, or whether you're talking about a Teamster shop or whatever. It's the same service-oriented model that exists out there. And until you empower yourselves locally and deal with your own problems locally, elect your own officers, you know, not depend on somebody up high with a six-figure salary and, you know, a wife making $500,000 a year, you know, to come in and solve the problem. It ain't gonna happen. Somebody wearing a $400 suit can't identify you that goes and buys your clothes in a thrift shop. No offense, that's what I mean.
Yo.
In any event, you know, you gotta do it. Just do it. Do it. Direct action. That's what the IWW believes. And no disrespect, but you see this? You have the IW dead way back when. You see this day here? It's still alive. Yeah.